Klossowski's interpretation of Nietzsche's philosophy asserts that Nietzsche's valetudinary states, his states of sickness and attempts at finding health, were encoded into his philosophical doctrines. And originally I'd planned to end the episodes on Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle there, because that's what primarily interests me, Klossowski's interpretation of Nietzsche's thought and how his interpretation can be assimilated into a general understanding of Nietzsche's philosophy. But I realize that there's a great deal that would be left out of the picture if we didn't now turn our attention to the inverse consideration, how Nietzsche's philosophy informs our understanding of his sickness. We've been using his inner states to decipher his philosophy. Now we'll use his philosophy to decipher Nietzsche's inner states, to understand his physiology, and particularly the events that led up to his collapse into permanent insanity in the year 1888. First, I'd like to call to mind that unpublished note that we considered last time near the end of the episode. Nietzsche says that he realizes that he's been a thoroughgoing nihilist until recently, that as he worked with such fervor toward his goal, he eventually came to realize that goallessness itself was his goal, and the zeal with which he worked served to hide that fact from him. In Klossowski's reading, Nietzsche's experience of the eternal return and the thought that was formed in the wake of that experience makes such a thing as a goal or a meaning into utter nonsense. And yet this is exactly what Nietzsche demanded, because his concern was ultimately with determining the difference between health and sickness. If his doctrine of the return simply produces non-action, non-resistance, that would be indistinguishable from exhaustion, from weariness, or from sickness. So Nietzsche followed his own sentiments, his own prejudices, and began to use, as Klossowski says, exploit his eternal return. He conscripts the thought of the return into this new project of the revaluation and the overman. The conspiracy under the sign of the Vicious Circle is Klossowski's name for Nietzsche's political project, which will use the eternal return as a method of selection, to create a new cadre of masters to rule over the gregarious, utilitarian modern society that's enslaving all of us to its ends, but for no higher goal, no higher purpose, for nothing other than economic growth and satisfaction of our existing desires and safety and security and comfort and all of these things. But is there a step beyond this phase in Nietzsche's thought? Is there something after the revaluation? There's been a fair bit of controversy over whether or not Nietzsche intended to finish his magnum opus, the revaluation of all values. And, simply he collapsed before he could finish the project, or whether he actually abandoned it in the final year of his lucidity. Klossowski takes the latter view, that Nietzsche actually moved on from the revaluation, and he begins the final chapter of Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle by citing a note that Nietzsche wrote sometime between the end of 1887 and the beginning of 1888, in which Nietzsche, somewhat surprisingly, charts a history of phases of his thought. Or, at the very least, they seem to be phases of his thought. He entitles the note, "The Journal of the Nihilist." And it is in that context that I called to mind that statement, that he himself has been a nihilist for most of his career. This points us in the direction that the note is about him, that it is self-referential. Because after all, where would Nietzsche draw the authority to speak of the phases of a nihilist's thought unless he had experienced these things within himself? So Nietzsche writes, quote, "The shudder caused by the false discovery, emptiness, no more thought. The powerful affects revolve around objects with no value. The spectator of these absurd inclinations for and against, reflective, ironic, cold with regard to oneself. The strongest inclinations appear as lies, as if we had to believe in their objects, as if they had wanted to seduce us. The stronger force asks, what's the use? All things remain, but serve no useful purpose. Atheism as the absence of an ideal, phase of a no and a passionate doing no. Accumulated desire is discharged in it, seeking a link, a relation, an adjuration. Phase of mistrust even of the no, even of doubt, even of irony, even of mistrust. Catastrophe is not the lie something divine. Does not the value of all things consist in the fact that they are false? Is not despair simply the consequence of a belief in the divine nature of truth? Do not the lie and falsification, the conversion to the false, imply the introduction of a meaning? Do they not themselves have a value, a meaning, a goal? Should we not believe in God, not because he is true, but because he is false? End quote. And I just think there's so much to analyze here philosophically. We could say that in a very strange way, it establishes a kind of coherence from the beginning of Nietzsche's project until its very end. The world is justified aesthetically in his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, and here he returns to aesthetics as a justification, the lie, the falsification of the world, posited as the opposite of the despair caused by what? The belief in the divine nature of the truth. And remember what Nietzsche says in The Gay Science about our faith. We godless anti-metaphysicians, he says it's the same as Plato's faith, that God is truth and truth is divine. In other words, the Socratic will to truth at all costs, which despises any falsification, any distortion of the world, and thus makes war on art and tragedy. That is the source of the nihilists' despair. Nietzsche recognized that all the way back in his first book, that eventually the theoretical approach to life and the search for truth, rational truth, the search for a meaning of life through the intellect via rationalism would begin to recognize its limits, and eventually the theoretical man would begin to search for a coast on the wide wastes of the oceans of knowledge. That was how he put it back in The Birth of Tragedy. And yet, during the time of The Gay Science, when he says that we share the faith of Plato in our search for the truth, in our evaluation of the truth over falsehood, what is Nietzsche's favorite metaphor around that time? What's the open ocean? The traveler who embarks into uncharted seas. The Gay Science is very much a book that celebrates the will to truth, and arguably Nietzsche's entire corpus of work involves this attempt to follow the will to truth, perhaps more sincerely than any philosopher has done previously, because after all, with them it was always a confession of their impulses. The evidence for this, from Nietzsche's perspective, is that they were unwilling to transgress against the moral boundaries of the culture in their pursuit of the truth. So we immoralist philosophers, we experimenters and tempters, will wander in the forbidden country and pursue any possibility that presents itself. It doesn't have to be circumscribed by the collective morals. But is this not to ignore the warning that Nietzsche himself laid down in his first book, that the pursuit of truth at any cost is a kind of sickness? That falsification of the world, or rather the artistic representation of the world, is necessary. And thus the really fascinating thing in this note is that what Nietzsche labels as a catastrophe is the recognition that the lie is also divine. Isn't that implicit in his work at the very beginning of his career? Could you say that in some way Nietzsche has come full circle? It would seem as though he's passed through all of these different states of the soul and ultimately been delivered back to the religious mindset that he exalted in his first text, or even indeed the religious mindset in which he was raised, because he does not say the gods in this note. He says God. Perhaps we ought to believe in God, not because he is true, but because he is false. And it's worth noting he ends off with a question mark, so this is not an unequivocal statement. If anything, the nature of this catastrophe, so-called, is the emergence of these several very uncomfortable questions, which raise their heads in the midst of Nietzsche's attempt at the revaluation. That meaning that he is to insert into existence as a deceiver, as an imposter philosopher. Because the implicit premise involved in all of this is that mankind needs beliefs which are false, and he specifically invokes the monotheistic God, presumably the Christian God. And one might say that, but Nietzsche ultimately disagrees with the values that are signified by that God. These are sick herd values. And so they are. And yet Nietzsche has said, in some of the material we considered in the last episode, that the herd should have their illusions. We should not dispute with those opinions that give the masses a remission, that we should harness the herd morality as it exists, that in fact it is, for lack of a better turn of phrase, right and good that the people should have their God. Lucidity is for those of us spirited types who are able to stand apart from the herd without perishing. And so the really terrifying thing for Nietzsche, I think, the reason why he calls these questions a catastrophe, is the possibility that he himself is not strong enough to endure a world without the sanction of the divine. That such a quest for pure lucidity has led him to despair. His God, his divine, has been the truth, the terrible truth, the fatal truth that one has to be strong enough to endure. But is he strong enough? The list he gives reads like a laundry list of depressive symptoms. Everything seems absurd. There's a lack of any ideal, any drive, any reason to do anything. He says that the strongest voice within asks, "What's the use?" And the salvation he sees, or at least the potential for it, is in saying no even to his no against all that is false, hypocritical, or deluded, all those beliefs that seem to lack in lucidity. Where has the rejection of that gotten him? And so he says no even to that no, to the rejection of those things. And again, I think many of these concerns have existed in Nietzsche's work from the beginning, but here it is dramatized as a series of states. He's identifying these different tendencies within himself, charting which inclinations he's followed, charting the consequences of following them. And his inclinations have led him to a place of absurdity, for lack of a better word. And I think one of the most important lines, especially as regards the understanding we've developed of the vicious circle, occurs at the very beginning of the note. Quote, "The powerful affects revolve around objects with no value," end quote. So for one, an image of circular motion and the circular motion of affects, in other words, feelings, moods, tonalities of the soul, which are in themselves only signs, signifiers of impulses, and the objects of those impulses have in themselves no value. See, because every impulse or every drive has the object of its desires, we might say. Inherently, they have no value in and of themselves. They are valueless. They are simply ascribed a subjective value by the drives. Because how could there be value in anything when everything is simply revolving around a circuit, which never leads anywhere outside of itself? And this, for Klossowski, is what the eternal return ultimately is. Nietzsche experiences himself as a series of discontinuous states revolving in a circular motion without meaning or end. Having done away with the notion of the stable, coherent self, the individual ego consciousness, who is rational and who is responsible for his own actions, all that is left is this carousel of different states. They could even be called different individualities, different Nietzsches. It is an absurd existence. Why not return to the very place where you started from and begin to affirm beliefs not because they're true, but because they're false? There is another note that Klossowski cites, quote, "And how many new gods are still possible? As for myself, in whom the religious, that is to say, God-forming instinct, occasionally becomes active at impossible times, how differently, how variously the divine has revealed itself to me each time. So many strange things have passed before me in those timeless moments that fall into one's life as if from the moon, when one no longer has any idea how old one is or how young one will yet be. I should not doubt that there are many kinds of gods. There are some one cannot imagine without a certain halcyon and frivolous quality in their makeup. Perhaps light feet are even an integral part of the concept God. Is it necessary to elaborate that a God prefers to stay beyond everything bourgeois and rational, and between ourselves, also beyond good and evil? His prospect is free, in Goethe's words. And to call upon the inestimable authority of Zarathustra in this instance, Zarathustra goes so far as to confess, I would believe only a God who could dance. To repeat, how many new gods are still possible? Zarathustra himself, to be sure, is merely an old atheist. He believes neither in old nor new gods. Zarathustra says he would, but Zarathustra says he will not. Do not misunderstand him. The type of God after the type of creative spirits of great men. End quote. So Zarathustra, Nietzsche's fictional character, we could say he's one of many masks for Nietzsche, for these individualities within Nietzsche. He's Nietzsche's prophet. Carl Jung saw him as the wise old man archetype within Nietzsche expressing himself. And Zarathustra is an atheist. An atheist who says if he would believe in a god, it would only be one who can dance, but that he will not believe in a god nonetheless. And Nietzsche cautions us not to misunderstand that. And therefore it's fascinating to consider that he opens this note by declaring that he has this religious instinct, his god-forming instinct, and that it flares up from time to time, that strange things have passed before him where ideas fall into his lap, almost like a revelation, we might say. And these gods, perhaps the source of these ideas, are fleeting. They have light feet. So the God-forming instincts don't abide for very long. The God dances away, so to speak. So what does this reveal about Nietzsche's mental states? Again, they're a kind of discontinuity. That much is obvious. But furthermore, to identify Nietzsche strictly with Zarathustra, as though Zarathustra represented Nietzsche the person in any kind of faithful manner, that would be a mistake. Zarathustra, that Dionysiac monster and annihilator of morality, Zarathustra, that first prophet to declare good and evil, historically, and thus the first to deny good and evil, and here, as Nietzsche puts it, that stalwart atheist. This is one voice among many within Nietzsche. He's a particularly strong voice, a voice that he immortalizes by dramatizing this character. But if Zarathustra is, we might say, like the prophet of the most profound atheism, well, then what are we to make of Nietzsche's despair, specifically a despair at having reached this profoundly atheistic state? Atheism, again, as he says in the note we read before this one, the lack of an ideal. Is there not a connection between the God-forming impulse and the ideal? Klossowski's comment on all of this is that it seems that the entirety of Nietzsche's philosophy has led him to the abyss, to the vertigo and nausea at the infinite void of meaninglessness, yawning before him in all its lucidity. And the gods, which we might interpret as irrational, maniacal, or histrionic states, seem to be now flooding back into his consciousness, seizing him with revelations, almost as a kind of repudiation of this suicidal truth-seeking. And we should recall how Klossowski sees the impetus for much of Nietzsche's philosophy in this sort of rebellion of the somatic versus the spiritual. And why? Because Nietzsche felt the active forces within his body could attack the consciousness, for whom thinking was a kind of suffering. In any case, it's somewhat ironic, given the contrast established here, that Zarathustra opposed himself to the spirit of gravity. Because in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that's his sort of like one of the few antagonist-type characters that appears. We might say he's the devil, too, within the moral or the religious myth that Nietzsche creates in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But here we have the gods as these light-footed, fleeting things, these beautiful revelations that fall into Nietzsche's lap and then dance away. And Zarathustra is the one who teaches the terrifying doctrine of the eternal return. And how does he introduce that idea? What is the section title, right? It's the greatest weight. It's like the heaviest idea, the heaviest thing that one could ever take on. Even though the eternal return coincided with a high moment for Nietzsche, it's often been interpreted as terrifying, including by Nietzsche's own friends. And I've already mentioned this in a couple of the previous episodes, but I thought in this final exploration of Klossowski's book, we should look at the primary sources and what they have to say about the tone of Nietzsche's communication of the eternal return, the vibe, more than the content. So for one, Lou Salome wrote about this retrospectively, quote, "Unforgettable for me are those hours in which he first confided to me his secret, whose inevitable fulfillment and validation he anticipated with shudders. Only with a quiet voice and with all the signs of deepest horror did he speak about this secret. Life, in fact, produced such suffering in him that the certainty of an eternal return of life had to mean something horrifying to him. The quintessence of the teaching of eternal recurrence, later constructed by Nietzsche as a shining apotheosis of life, formed such a deep contrast to his own painful feelings about life that it gives us intimations of being an uncanny mask." End quote. Now, Klossowski disagrees with Lou's interpretation of the situation here, as would I, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that he doesn't just take her assessment uncritically. He points out that Nietzsche, quote, "had insisted too much on the intensive and thus vital character of suffering, not to see in the return the strength of the desire that is affirmed in it." End quote. In other words, the idea that Nietzsche actually negatively valued life because of his sickness is not borne out by a sincere reading of his philosophy. And Klossowski says that Lew's presumption here is an all-too-human interpretation of Nietzsche's apparent horror at the eternal return. Because after all, Nietzsche's own idea of the eternal return quickly became involved with the use of that doctrine as a selective force, which means he knew it could be a painful thought, but considered that it would be beneficial to the metamorphosis of the species to introduce it anyway. It's an experiment, a kind of experiment that might destroy many lives in the process of its introduction, but surely Nietzsche had to therefore understand how horrifying the thought could be. He considered that it might be a paralyzing thought for many people. Again, it's part of a challenge of whether or not you're able to endure the thought of the eternal return or even use it as a kind of blessing on your life. But this is quite aside from the contradiction that Lew perceived in the emotional impression of his presentation of the idea to her on a personal level versus the emotional impression of the eternal return as communicated in his work. While Klossowski disagrees with her read of the situation, and again, so do I, she comes up with that explanation. That's like her way of trying to square the circle in her own head to account for this disparity between Nietzsche's insistence that there's a joyousness to the eternal return and the fact that he literally shuddered with horror as he told her about it, assuming her recollection of the events is indeed genuine. Not saying she's lying, but people can perceive events in very different ways. And just to speak for myself, I've had many different experiences where me and a friend are both recounting the same event, and we have a very different perception of how the events transpired, and usually colored by how we felt about it emotionally. So in any case, let's move on. We have of equal interest the recollection of Franz Overbeck. And he writes, quote, "My own conclusions, after examining my own memories, as well as Miss Foster's narrative, particularly the contrast between Nietzsche's unhealthy state in 1884, when I myself visited him here in Basel at the Croix Blanche Hotel, and the impression of her brother's health that his sister says she had a few weeks later, most notably his cheerfulness during this reconciliation, have convinced me that, during this period, Nietzsche was subject to violent oscillations between the deepest depression and euphoric exaltations. And if I sometimes felt I was in contact with a mentally ill person during these years, the very manner in which Nietzsche, bedridden and suffering gravely from a migraine, one day tried to initiate me, for the first and last time, into his secret doctrine, could leave me with no doubt whatsoever that he was no longer master of his reason. Nietzsche confided his revelations of the eternal return to me during a visit to Basel in the summer of 1884, in the same mysterious fashion he had revealed it to Madame Andrea Salome, according to her own testimony. Bedridden, suffering, in a hoarse and sinister voice, he communicated to me part of his esoteric doctrine. Since these communications of 1884 were so totally incomprehensible to me, I concluded that he was undoubtedly talking about some kind of link with ancient philosophy. It was also to this effect that some years after Nietzsche's collapse, I spoke with Rode, who shared completely my opinion as to the origin of this doctrine, but who, for the rest, refused to speak of Nietzsche's use of it as anything other than a symptom of his morbid state." End quote. Salome, Overbeck, Rode, these are among Nietzsche's closest friends. In Lou Salome's case, the friendship ended abruptly, but nevertheless, she was in his life during the time in which the eternal return idea struck him. And Overbeck has the same experience that she does when Nietzsche tries to tell him about it. And Rode apparently says, this is a sick idea. This is an idea that's a product of Nietzsche's physical and mental illness, of his morbid states. So this is a real contradiction that they all felt this way. They all felt that the eternal return came with a sense of dread, either in their experience of the idea or in how Nietzsche communicated it. But again, there's this mismatch between that heavy tonality that Nietzsche's friends experienced and the high tonality that Nietzsche experienced and that he tried to communicate, but to no avail. But if it's not true, as Lou suspected, that this is a horror that comes out of a negative valuation of life due to the suffering in it, or the suffering in Nietzsche's own life, right? Well, then where does this horror seem to come from? Because, after all, suffering is something that Nietzsche roundly rejects as a basis of making such a judgment about life. It also seems too easy and too ordinary an explanation. It projects, perhaps, our own discomfort onto the idea, rather than attempting to fathom Nietzsche's inner life. Klossowski writes, quote, Lou seemed to neglect completely the crucial point of the revelation of the return. What was preoccupying Nietzsche at that time, and what he presented almost as a corollary to his doctrine, was merely the necessity for the individual to live again in a series of different individualities. End quote. And so it is as if this revelation of the truth during this high moment, hiking in Sils Maria, produced a trace, a memory of this positively interpreted excitation. That happens to coincide with an apparent revelation of the truth, because it was the truth as Nietzsche himself experienced it, this discontinuous self. And he associates the high feeling of this lucidity about himself with the image, which he shapes into an idea and eventually into a doctrine, the circle. But the feeling doesn't last, and so he teaches the doctrine as an attempt to relink himself back to that feeling. But he can't summon the feeling by an act of will, and Nietzsche knew that. And this is why the doctrine takes on so many forms. It's the reason for his preoccupations with different modes of validating the doctrine. First as a scientific theory, then as a principle of selection. By validating the return as a scientific hypothesis, it would gain the status of truthfulness as a quote-unquote fact. For that's the method in the modern world by which we establish such true beliefs, right? Or by enlisting the vicious circle as he did as a mode of selection, it makes it useful for the revaluation. It becomes true because it's useful. That validates the doctrine. It gives it force. But ultimately, the lucidity that this doctrine provides, because the high feeling no longer accompanies it, that lucidity itself becomes unbearable. And one could even say that the attempts to use the vicious circle as a selective principle, or to prove it as fact, are both attempts to escape that painful reality, that the image of the circle now only corresponds to a feeling of painful lucidity, a gaze into the abyss, of the ultimate meaninglessness of everything, and the trace of it arriving as a high moment is nothing other than a trace, and now actually it's the cause of further pain. The only way to get out of this would be to escape from this heavy, terrifying lucidity. And how does one do that? Perhaps by saying no even to their negations, by discarding lucidity altogether, discarding the true in favor of the false, which is, paradoxically, to throw oneself into the absurd truth that you've discovered. So I'm a carousel of unrelated states of mind revolving senselessly. The circle has returned me to the same place from which I started, and I should expect this, for there's no knowledge within the circle that doesn't lead back to itself. There's no goal, unless the circle itself is a goal, as Nietzsche puts it in Will to Power, unless there's a kind of joy to abandoning oneself to the circular movement. And arguably, this is what happens to Nietzsche. He abandons himself to the vicious circle. Of course, all he's really doing, if we believe Nietzsche's philosophy up to this point, is setting aside the mask, or rather all masks. If the ego is the coherence that takes the form of a mask at any given moment, that is precisely what Nietzsche will abandon, masking itself. Klossowski writes, quote, Nietzsche developed the phantasm of the mask from the same motif of unconscious dissimulation and the conscious simulacrum of the authentic. The mask is not only a metaphor of universal importance, but something to which Nietzsche had recourse in his own behavior toward his contemporaries. The mask hides the absence of a determinate physiognomy. It parallels his relationship with the unforeseeable and unfathomable chaos. The mask, which forms a determined physiognomy all the same, even when it hides its absence, belongs to external interpretation, but corresponds to an internal desire of suggestion. Even more, it reveals that the person who appears to wear the mask must also have decided on such and such a face with regard to, quote, himself. But, and this is the process he was pursuing, or that chaos was pursuing through him, Nietzsche would treat his own necessary ego as a mask, what he had become in order to be such and such an ego, end quote. So the mask is an internal desire to make some sort of suggestion about what one is. It belongs to external interpretation because one wishes to inspire a certain interpretation of what one is in the judgments of others, the external world. This external perception of coherence can in fact hide the absence of a coherence, or it can hide rather that one's physiognomy is indeterminate, we might say. As Nietzsche says, we wear many masks, we all adopt multiple personas. What does it mean to set aside all masks? To abandon the ego's habit of masking? The mask is coherence. It is the pretense of a consistent personality. That's the function of consciousness itself, if we'll remember, to impose a coherence, to aid the body, which is this fortuitous occurrence of impulses, to hold itself together as a momentary flourishing and victory of those impulses, to impose the illusion of unity on these multifarious and contradictory drives. The argument, then, is that in the moment of Nietzsche's collapse, he finally abandons this. He's finally swept away in the circle, and thus why his personality seems to fracture into multiple characters in his final days of fleeting lucidity. He will sign his letters with the name of gods and historical figures. He will imagine himself as something other than he is. He will write things that are increasingly absurd, but which read like the temporary surge of some impulse, rewriting reality, throwing itself into the false world that it creates through its representations or its phantasms. Every name of history is I. Nietzsche now signs his letters as Caesar, as Dionysus, as the crucified. And you could interpret this a couple of ways that ultimately signify the same outcome. Either he discarded all masks, or the center was dissolved, and therefore there's nothing really there except masks. And another pleasant surprise in Klossowski's analysis, for me at least, is that he rejects the trope that Nietzsche's philosophy somehow causes his insanity. He would say that we have the causality inverted in that analysis, and he makes this clear when he assesses Overbeck's sense of Nietzsche's sanity. Quote, Overbeck, his most trustworthy and honest confidant during the final 10 lucid years, examined the motives for the collapse scrupulously and with the greatest circumspection. It undoubtedly seemed conceivable to him that the madness had simply been the product of Nietzsche's particular way of life, but this is still a rather timid hypothesis. For if madness as madness could be the product of a way of life, when it would more certainly lie at its origin, it would function in a completely different manner, end quote. Again, the key point is seeing the code of Nietzsche's madness within his philosophy, not assigning a causal link between them. And if there were such a causal link, it would go in the other direction. The madness would be at the origin, and philosophy would be the product. Nevertheless, when we understand Nietzsche's eternal return as this revolving, this revolution of the affects, and the affects as that which give rise to phantasms, we might say that Nietzsche's collapse is a total revolution of the affects with a decohered center. The phantasms then dance across Nietzsche's mind, becoming gods, perhaps in a manner similar to the apotheosis of gods in the primordial mind of man. As Ernst Cassirer argued, perhaps any strong emotional excitation could become the basis for creating a god. Whatever the object of that excitation, it could become the signifier of some power beyond man, some power that reaches out and seizes mankind, that strikes him with some powerful drive, or even changes or transforms him, makes him other than what he is. And keep in mind, this is another aspect demanded by the eternal return. It's the return of self-forgetting, the return of being made other. In order to become what one is, one has to become other than what one was. And this process can never be completed, quote unquote. It can never be finished because there's no beginning and no end within the circle. Nietzsche himself began to describe his own mental state in some of his final letters as being thrown outside his center. What does it mean to be outside of one's own center? to be decentered? Is it this very decoherence, this abandonment of oneself to the circle? Klossowski interprets this and also attempts to interpret the meaning of Nietzsche's inability to communicate the eternal return to his friends in a satisfactory manner. Klossowski writes, quote, "These forces were themselves communicated one day at Sils Maria in the form of a movement around something whose approach remained forever forbidden, as if in accordance with a secret accord or liaison. First the ring, then the wheel of fortune, and finally the circulus viciosus deus. So many figures that in themselves presuppose a center, a focus, a void, perhaps even a god which inspires the circular movement and is expressed in it, yet which is kept at a distance. The centrifugal forces never flee the center forever, but approach it anew only in order to retreat from it again. Such as the vehement oscillations that overwhelm an individual so long as he seeks his own center and cannot see the circle of which he himself is a part. For if these oscillations overwhelm him, it is because each corresponds to an individuality other than the one he believes himself to be, from the point of view of the unfindable center. As a result, an identity is essentially fortuitous, and every identity must pass through a series of individualities in order for the fortuitousness of a particular identity to render them all necessary. What the eternal return implies as a doctrine is neither more nor less than the insignificance of the once and for all of the principle of identity or non-contradiction, which lies at the base of the understanding. If all things come to pass once and for all, then lacking intensity they fall back into the insignificance of meaning. But because intensity is the soul of the eternal return, all things acquire signification only through the intensity of the circle. But this is still only one possible statement of the thought of the return. The lived experience of the intensity of the circle, which is substituted for the principle of the once and for all, opens itself up to a number of individualities through which it passes, until it returns to the only one to whom the eternal return was revealed. The experience became obscure once Nietzsche tried to initiate his friends into it, as if into a semblance of a doctrine that required the understanding, and they felt the delirium. If the event at Turin proved them right, it also explained why they understood nothing of his whispered words, the only ones through which he could transmit to them the vertigo he experienced at Sils Maria." End quote. Nietzsche was always preoccupied with the chasm between the word itself and the experience that underlies the word. As Klossowski points out, this underscores all his interactions with his friends, the sense that there's a depth and authenticity which is peculiar to everyone and which only the subject really knows for himself. And perhaps in a sense he does not even know his own depth, for he only experiences it through its signs. But there's a further degree of removal between the sign, the mood, the feeling, the state of mind produced by the impulse, and the attempt to discharge that sign into the everyday code, which we call language. And while a word or an image may therefore carry a certain emotional signification for myself, associated with the trace of a past experience, it's precisely that which I cannot convey to others. We've discussed this aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy many times on the podcast. You could check out the episode on the genius of the species, or actually the episode on Protagoras and rhetoric that's more recent. Both would be helpful for exploring this topic. The key thing is perhaps that what is communicable in us is what is most common, rather what's most relatable or most average. What is best in you, what is most profound, is bound to be incommunicable. And thus we have to wonder if Nietzsche's awareness of the incommunicability of the high tonality he experienced with the eternal return, if that also colored his emotional state in speaking of it. That it is precisely the divergence between the feeling and the words that he spoke that so troubled him. His perception that the emotional power had been discharged now into a sign, something solidified, hardened, cooled. Perhaps his horror, his nausea, was in perceiving that he could never communicate the feeling to his friends as they stood before him, that his words were not being understood, as Overbeck readily admits, that he found it an incomprehensible doctrine. And of course he would, and especially from the standpoint of the high feeling Nietzsche experienced. These concerns about the chasm between our own depth and the communicable, intelligible world, Nietzsche had these concerns at a very young age. It's in fact one of his oldest preoccupations. Just as Nietzsche's delirium in his final years seemed to bring him back to where he started, so to speak, so too will our inquiry, our last episode on Klossowski's work, now bring us back to Nietzsche's childhood years for a brief moment. In the chapter entitled Consultation of the Paternal Shadow, Klossowski makes this detour into Nietzsche's juvenalia. He analyzes some writings from Nietzsche's youth that concern, among other things, Nietzsche's dreams, one of which he considered to be a premonition, as well as an abortive attempt at writing a horror story and excerpts from his childhood biography. The most important such memory is Nietzsche's recollection of a dream which he says he had at the age of 6, and which he recorded around the age of 13, and then again at the age of 17, and then never spoke of again. Nietzsche writes that in the dream he heard the funereal music of an organ coming from the church, and then saw his father's tomb open up. His father's form then goes into the church looking for little Carl Joseph Nietzsche, Nietzsche's younger brother, who was about a year old at the time. His father's spirit, or his resurrected form, then takes the child in his arms and carries him back into the tomb. Most striking is when Nietzsche writes, quote, "The day after this night, little Joseph is suddenly taken ill with cramps and convulsions, and dies within a few hours. Our anguish was immense. My dream was fulfilled completely. The little cadaver, moreover, was laid in my father's arms." End quote. Now, Klossowski compares the first account of the dream with the later recollection, and he finds small discrepancies, even with the details that Nietzsche gives as regards the waking world. For in that later account, he says, Joseph wasn't laid in his father's arms, but rather buried beside his father's tomb. And Klossowski analyzes the dream critically, attempting to comprehend it in relation to Nietzsche's own feelings towards his father and his mother. And Klossowski goes about this exploration of Nietzsche's relationship with his parents in a manner that I don't really agree with. He attempts to decipher Nietzsche's statement in Ecce Homo that he comes from two lines of descent. He says his mother is still living and growing old, or he says, as my mother, I am still living and growing old, whereas as my father, I am already dead and buried. Klossowski interprets this statement symbolically, and he interprets it as a kind of an inverse of the Oedipal image of the family. Insofar as, in the Oedipal complex, the son attempts to kill the father in order to overthrow him, so that he can be the father and take possession of the mother, in symbolical terms, to become the masculine force that possesses the feminine. But Nietzsche sets his dead father next to his living mother, and attempts not to become his father, but to become his own mother. In other words, Nietzsche has yet to be born. He has to birth himself anew. He has to recreate himself. And therefore, in becoming who you are, you birth yourself again. You become your own mother in that sense. Something along those lines. Now, as for my personal opinion, I think some of what Klossowski argues in this chapter is a stretch. Obviously, Freud hadn't written yet when Nietzsche was alive. So Nietzsche couldn't have consciously been attempting to invert the Oedipal family image with the kind of language he uses in Ecce Homo. I mean, you could argue, if you're a Freudian, that the Oedipus complex is a real thing, and therefore it wouldn't be too surprising if Nietzsche intuited it and then tried to produce an inversion of it in their psychic life or something. But for my part, I don't think these interpretations really explain that much about Nietzsche or his personality. I'm going to focus more on the insights that Klossowski draws that make the most sense to me and seem the most grounded in reality. I'm not as interested in this kind of symbolic interpretation, we might say. But Klossowski notes that Nietzsche was raised by women, by feminine figures, his mother, his aunts. He's taken care of by his sister when he's an invalid later in life. But of course, earlier in their relationship at times, Nietzsche's often annoyed with her, trying to insert herself into his affairs. I don't want to say necessarily mothering herself, but very concerned with Nietzsche taking care of her brother and things of this nature. So Klossowski argues perhaps he became most alienated from the feminine through their image, through what the image of the feminine was in his family life. He comes to detest their cloying, pestering concern with him, their pity for him, their attempts to take care of him. Why would this be? Well, because Nietzsche intends to become his own mother. He's going to take care of himself, cure himself, look after his own affairs. He'll become the inverse, the unpitying, cruel mother, perhaps represented more by the Kali archetype rather than the benevolent Mother Mary. And the more interesting insight of this section, in my opinion, is Klossowski's sense that the dead father, which Nietzsche still lives within him, is in fact a sign of transformation. In order to be born anew, what is in him must already die off. He draws on the imagery of this dream and points out how his father's tomb yawned open, a chasm in the earth, an abyss, the Greek word for which is chaos. One could read this dream as the father's spirit returning to unite the child with chaos, with the abyss. In this interpretation, Nietzsche's dead father is the end that must occur so that there can be a new beginning. The father becomes the symbol of death and rebirth that constitutes the eternal becoming. And so rather than the mother and father being counterposed as health and sickness, the living mother and the dead father could be interpreted in that way. Klossowski says the mother represents something more like the center, the stable identity, the living memory by which we establish a continuity between one's past self and one's future self. And so as a symbol of continuity, the mother can be a symbol of being, something like that. But again, it's of great significance that Nietzsche experienced his 36th year, the age that his father was when his father died. Nietzsche experienced his own 36th year as his lowest point, almost as if the paternal shadow was manifesting within Nietzsche, as if the father's spirit was returning for the child once again. Nietzsche had to pass through his worst bouts of illness before convalescing and becoming the philosopher of the eternal return. Perhaps that, then, is the meaning of the father for Nietzsche, not so much a premonition of a painful death, which was the destiny that he shared with his literal father, but rather it's a premonition of the becoming that takes place in the circuit of the return. Forgetting and anamnesis. Being made other than what you are in order to become who you are. And again, Klossowski may have a point here. I'm not convinced it fits into this anti-Oedipal schema, because if anything, read in this way, Nietzsche's life is actually very Oedipal. His father has to die before he can live. Not just his living father, but the traces of his father's personality within him. And true enough, Nietzsche appropriates a number of other father figures, or near-father figures, in his young life especially. Older men that he looks up to and attempts to follow in the footsteps of. The best examples are Friedrich Ritschl and Burckhardt. The most significant is Richard Wagner. It is, of course, after Nietzsche's break with Wagner and his repudiation of Wagner's ideas that his philosophy really comes into its own. It's when Nietzsche pays tribute to his Lutheran father's life with a new headstone commemorating him that he's finally able to surpass him and move beyond him. But what are we to make of the premonitory nature of the dream? The fact that it seems to forecast events before they happen, both the death of little Karl Joseph, but also these profound themes of becoming and self-transformation in Nietzsche's life. We might ask whether the dream was really a premonition, or whether this was a creative or even unconscious creative reimagining on Nietzsche's part. The dream was recollected many years after the fact, after all. And for an example of another such strange dream, with perhaps a premonitory element from his childhood years, Nietzsche once wrote of a nightmare in which he and his friend, Wilhelm, who seems to be a fictional character created in the dream. Wilhelm's also Nietzsche's middle name. But in any case, they're gallivanting through the fields, exploring the countryside, and the mood is one of supreme joy. But then a scream pierces the air. In the dream, Nietzsche and his friend quickly realize that the scream came from a patient in the nearby insane asylum, and the mood immediately changes. The two friends stop conversing, and dusk falls, and they try to find their path, but it has disappeared, and they happen upon a man, a hunter with a rifle and a hunting dog accompanying him, and they go to him for help. And he initially seems friendly, and he leads them through the woods, but soon the tone becomes even more sinister. A group of masked individuals with torches spring out of the darkness on all sides, and the young Nietzsche then woke up. So the joy, the high tonality of the dream is interrupted by the scream of the insane patient. And indeed, that would be the fate of Nietzsche himself after his collapse, interned as a patient at Jena. And what of the masked figures, the assailants? Are these the many masks of so many different individualities encircling and seizing the young Nietzsche? The insurrection of the affects that was bound to overtake him, the victory of the somatic over the spiritual? Or consider, in addition to this, another piece of juvenalia, the sketch of a horror story that Nietzsche produced while on vacation at his uncle's house. In that text, he writes in the first person as a character named Euphorion, a medical student. He vents his hatred for the human race, declaring, quote, "disgusting, such rot," end quote. And he takes joy in his amoral and misanthropic experiments upon people, to make a skinny nun grow fat, make a fat man waste away to nothing. And he wishes to make the young grow old quickly. Is this not almost a caricature of the experimenter that Nietzsche would later imagine, a master of the earth who, out of his antipathy for mankind as it is, mankind's smallness, pettiness, human all too human limitations, this kind of figure would then wish to apply his physiological studies, his physiological genius, and sacrifice innumerable people in the pursuit of achieving something for the advancement of the species. So is this horror story sketch, too, a premonition of one of the masks that will eventually take hold of Nietzsche? Again, I think the importance is not whether or not they are real premonitions. That's sort of a metaphysical question that we could maybe set aside. It is important to some degree that in at least one case, Nietzsche experienced it as such, in the case of the dream about his father. And in any case, it indicates certain impulses, certain states of the soul that were with him from the very beginning and constitutive of who he was, such that they present themselves almost as like a truth of his destiny. And these are, with a retrospective eye, the earliest signs of the trajectory of his life. And perhaps one could even say that these experiences reveal that the discontinuity of the self, that Nietzsche would later codify into philosophical language, was something he experienced in these moments. Perhaps these bits of juvenalia represent a god dropping an idea into the young Nietzsche's lap, as though something falling from the moon, as he says in that note that we looked at the beginning. And this, this dream of being encircled by masks, the dream of the father taking the child into the chaos so that he can be reborn again. And this brings us back to the question of authenticity and the depths of the human soul. How can Nietzsche know his own depth? In this discontinuous series, how can he establish an identity? Where is the center? Who is the real Nietzsche? Is there a real Nietzsche? Klossowski writes, quote, "The obsession with authenticity, namely with his unexchangeable and irreducible depth, and all his efforts to attain it, this is what constituted Nietzsche's primary and ultimate preoccupation, hence his feeling of not having been born yet. Fundamental discovery. What I have been told about my private life, about my inner life, is a lie. There must therefore be an outside of myself where my authentic depth would lie. Two possibilities. Either it lies in history in the past, Greece, or some other period of history, or else it lies in whatever the contemporary world, experienced as an absence of myself, creates as my future. I do not exist for my contemporary friends. Either science, the physiological investigation of the body, this unknown reality, or else the economy of the universe, chaos, which reveals to me the laws of my own behavior, the simulation of chaos. Two ways of conceiving my own temporality. My constitutive elements are dispersed in past time and in the future. I am confined somewhere, and I will never manage to find myself again. The message the prisoner sends to me is unintelligible. I am shut inside language, and what belongs to me lies on the outside, in the time which the universe follows, in which history recounts. The memory that outlives humans is my mother, and the chaos that turns around on itself is my father." End quote. And thus, the way Klossowski puts it here, the search for one's depth, for one's authentic, unexchangeable possessions, is a preoccupation of Nietzsche's earliest years, and it can be extrapolated into the impetus for all of his philosophizing, all of his searches for knowledge. His search for authenticity, for a culture that accords with the language of the unspoken in the Hellenic world, or his exploration of physiology, the investigation of the body, the attempt to understand the universe, Nietzsche's gay science, his detours into the Boscovich and the time atom theories, his first philosophical insights that sprang from his work on the pre-Platonics. All of this activity is one long attempt to find himself, to lay hold of himself. And so Klossowski poses the question, when did the catastrophe really begin? With the collapse in Turin? Well, his friends saw precedents for the collapse a couple of years before in 1887. Many of them were disturbed and began to think he was mentally ill by 1884, sometimes even earlier. Perhaps the real catastrophe then was that in the act of laying hold of himself, of affirming his identity as a fortuitous discovery, Nietzsche created this image of the circle. The act of forging his identity coincided with the formation of the vicious circle. In other words, Nietzsche's laying hold of an identity is only possible by situating himself within this ring of becoming, of constantly being thrown outside oneself in order to become what one is. Klossowski quotes from Nietzsche's reflections on his youth at the age of 19, in which Nietzsche writes, quote, "I can cast a grateful glance on anything that could happen to me, whether joy or suffering. Events have led me to this point, like a child. Perhaps it is time to grasp the reins of the events and to leave life. And thus, as long as he believes, man manages to free himself from everything that had and hitherto embraced him. He doesn't need to break his connections. Without knowing it, these connections fall away when a god orders it. And where then is the ring that embraces everything at the end? Is it the world? Is it God?" End quote. Where is the ring that embraces everything? The language here is striking given Nietzsche's later ideas, and Klossowski compares this bit of juvenalia to one of Nietzsche's aphorisms in Beyond Good and Evil from many, many years later in 1886. Quote, "Around the hero everything turns into tragedy, around the demigod into a satyr play, and around God, what? Perhaps into world." End quote. So even as a young man, at the age of 19, Nietzsche had imagined freeing himself from everything that had embraced him hitherto. He imagined all of the connections, everything that perhaps bound him to his old identity as the son of a Lutheran pastor, Karl Nietzsche, for example. That could be instantly banished by the divine command of a god. He expresses the amor fati, gratefulness towards everything that has happened, but nevertheless looks to the future, to a new becoming. Who is God in this analogy of the young Nietzsche? Is it not a command from within Nietzsche himself? He says the only thing that is needful is that a man believes. Believes in what? His own becoming. The fact that he's able to recreate himself anew. And so it becomes ever clearer how the God-creating impulse that Nietzsche spoke of at the beginning of his final year of writing, the new valuation of falsehood, of the lie as divine, that catastrophe, right? And coming with it the celebration of the coming of many fleeting gods. In a way, it's all a return to sentiments that Nietzsche had expressed long ago. But it's a very different thing to believe in a god or gods out of the divinity of falsehood than it is to declare oneself to be God. One is an almost romantic kind of belief. It's not even that far from a sentiment we might find somewhat ordinary. For example, arguably the sentiment appears in the novel The Life of Pi. The better story is the one with God in it, something like that. And yet the other idea that one is oneself a god is the kind of thing that lands you in the insane asylum usually. And yet this seems to be precisely the kind of mania that took hold of Nietzsche when he begins identifying himself under these different masks, under these different names, different masks of the divine. Nietzsche wrote to Jacob Burckhardt on the 5th of January, 1889, immediately preceding the period of his collapse, quote, "Actually, I would much rather be a Basel professor than God, but I have not ventured to carry my private egoism so far as to omit creating the world on his account," end quote. And it's a very funny letter in spite of how sad it is, given that it's signifying Nietzsche's imminent collapse. But it's almost as if Nietzsche is saying, I would have liked to simply remain with you, teaching philology at Basel, but as it happens, my fate is that I have to become a divine figure. I have to break the history of humanity in two. I have to communicate the revelation of the deepest truth of the universe. And in fact, by this action, sort of create a new world, create the world anew. And that's precisely what Nietzsche purported to have done. And therefore, could we not say that as he creates a new world around him, as his vision becomes a world, does Nietzsche not become, in his own eyes, a kind of God? And in some sense, the distinction that a rational mind might draw between creating a God and becoming a God is irrelevant here, because this distinction depends on that coherence of the self. If the center decoheres and you merge with the circle, you merge with the chaos of existence, the chaos of becoming, there's no longer any inside or outside. Determining what is inside the self or what is outside the self, determining which forces are external to you and which are within you, and therefore determining which among the external forces are to be resisted or not resisted. Well, Klossowski writes that this would be comprehensible, quote, only if one presumed that the individual, in the traditional moral sense, maintains its durable identity, but it becomes unintelligible if the individual is only a fiction, as it was for Nietzsche, and if the principle of identity is abolished, end quote. So, in the final phase of Nietzsche's becoming, the euphoria of Turin, which preceded the general collapse and the apparent end of Nietzsche's lucidity, the distinction between Nietzsche's affects and the forces of the external world, that all disappears. And I say the apparent end because Klossowski seems to suspect that the general collapse could be understood as a kind of hyper-lucidity in a way. Again, we can find the antecedent in Nietzsche's own philosophy. Nietzsche wrote many years earlier, in 1884, quote, we believe in the external world as the cause of its action on us, but in fact it is precisely this action, which takes place unconsciously, that we have transformed into the external world. Our work is whatever the world makes us confront, which will henceforth react upon us. Time is necessary for it to be achieved, but this time is so short, end quote. Klossowski's comment, quote, in no time at all, the external world, our work, this is what his euphoria recuperated. How can the world again become internalized? How can we again become externalized so that we are ourselves the effective action of the world? Where in us would the world end? Where would it begin? There is no limit to one and the same action. The euphoria of Turin led Nietzsche to maintain, in a kind of interpretive availability, the residues of everything that constituted the past in the context of his present experience. What everyday life normally holds at a distance so as to receive only the bare fact of the day after day, this is what suddenly erupted in Nietzsche. The horizon of the past crept closer until it merged with the everyday, until they both occupied the same level. In return, everyday things abruptly receded into the distance. Yesterday became today, the day before yesterday spilled into tomorrow. The landscape of Turin, the monumental squares, the promenades along the Po River were bathed in a kind of Claude Lorraine luminosity, end quote. The identity which Nietzsche has held on to up to now with a tenuous grip slips away. The gods that dance across his mind during the high states of the soul become indistinguishable from Nietzsche himself. He no longer dons the mask dons him. Nietzsche as God, as Dionysus, as the crucified one, creates the world around him, binds it within his own ring. Again, is this the end of Nietzsche's lucidity or a kind of super-lucidity that sees directly, experiences directly, the chaos of becoming, that experiences the difference between outside and inside as the illusion it really is, and experiences the discontinuity of the self fully and richly without hiding it from oneself through the suggestion of the mask with its definite physiognomy? Klossowski devotes a great deal of time to analyzing the symbolic content of Nietzsche's letters during this time, as well as his obsession with Cosima Wagner, that erupted to the forefront during his insanity. Cosima seems to merge with Ariadne in Nietzsche's mind, and that would make Nietzsche, as Dionysus, her rightful lover, and not the now-deceased Richard Wagner. Certainly much of this is fascinating, but I think much of it is better explored through your own reading of the book, because it doesn't really help us to further elucidate the philosophical or psychological themes, more so than we've already done. So, in other words, there's quite a bit more in this final chapter by Klossowski. Even after everything we've discussed in this series, I've still left plenty of stones unturned in Klossowski's book. There are plenty of nuances and complications for you to explore during your own reading. But there's a paragraph in the final chapter that really beautifully explains how Nietzsche's madness can be seen as a kind of hyper-consciousness, a hyper-lucidity, and how Nietzsche's madness truly is a reflection of his philosophical project. Quote, "If the process that destroys the reality principle consists in a suspension or extinction of the consciousness of the external world, it would then seem that Nietzsche, on the contrary, had never been more lucid than during these final days in Turin. What he was conscious of was the fact that he had ceased to be Nietzsche, that he had been, as it were, emptied of his person. But this absence of identity was made known in an enormous and inconsistent declaration, which attributed a divine physiognomy to this inconsistency, a declaration that was equivalent to the universal gesture of divine figures. How could he knowingly give himself over to such a spectacle, if not because he knew that no one would believe what he was saying? The director of the play remained the Nietzschean consciousness, but it was no longer the Nietzschean ego. It was no longer the I that signed itself Nietzsche." End quote. And with that, I'll give my final thoughts on what I think we are to make of Klossowski's interpretation of Nietzsche's life and work in the final analysis. I'm glad that something just in my gut told me I should do a third episode on this book, and the only other time I've done that was with Heidegger last season. And Heidegger's work is at least as complicated as Klossowski's, if not more so. But anyway, I think this was necessary because if we just looked at the way that, Klossowski interprets Nietzsche's philosophy through his illness, it wouldn't be apparent how important Nietzsche's philosophy is for interpreting Nietzsche's collapse, interpreting Nietzsche's mental states. Again, this is not the old chestnut that Nietzsche's philosophy drove him insane, but that whatever the cause of his insanity, it was an insanity that expressed that same philosophy. That it can be seen as Nietzsche's philosophy drawing its final conclusions, perhaps because Nietzsche's philosophy was always a product of sickness in its origins, or because it's the nature of psychosis that it should conform itself to the kind of psychoses that are uniquely our own. Every type of psychotic break with reality, however we try to classify these breaks or categorize them, ends up being its own peculiar case. But from an objective point of view, Klossowski's work is somewhat damning. Many of the apparently insane excesses of Nietzsche's philosophy about the masters of the earth sacrificing human beings for the sake of their grand project, that may actually be insane. These could be read as the ravings of a man who believed that his consciousness was merging with God, and he had the right to create the world anew. In the general moral understanding of humanity, the only being who has the right to make such determinations about human life, to use lives or even to waste them, destroy them because of an evaluative judgment about them, that in traditional religion is reserved for God alone. The kind of person who believes themselves to be similarly empowered would therefore be eo ipso claiming to be a god. And thus did not Nietzsche belong in the insane asylum, just for having expressed these ideas? According to modern standards, really he would, right? Isn't the eventual transformation of his consciousness into these divine delusions quite superfluous to the charge of his insanity, a mere formality by that point? In other words, he had already done everything possible to claim to be a god. To actually state this fact outright was a mere inevitability or something like that. But as many of us listening are Nietzscheans, this argument will not be sufficient. That is simply to judge Nietzsche according to our everyday moral standards. And are these not sick standards? The gregarious values that will enslave the human race and destroy it and level it, and all for nothing, right? These are the values Nietzsche combated. And this objection need not only come from, vitalist right-wing interpreters of Nietzsche. I would dare say that a thinker such as Foucault would have a critical word to say about judging Nietzsche's philosophy from the standpoint of the norms of sanity that are enforced and already established by the current institutions and power structures. To brand Nietzsche as crazy, we might say, is not in itself an objective judgment. It's a discursive act of power, wherein society's sanity, its definition of sanity, silences those who deviate from it. To all of this, I would say, fair enough. We could instead judge Nietzsche's philosophy from its own standpoint. He writes in The Will to Power number 864, quote, "All great men, the most healthy in particular, have always been sick at certain periods of their lives. Great disturbances of the emotions, the passion for power, love, revenge, are all accompanied by very profound perturbations. And as for decadence, every man who does not die prematurely manifests it in almost every respect. He therefore knows from experience the instincts which belong to it. For half his life, nearly every man is decadent." End quote. Nietzsche said outright in Ecce Homo that his insight into decadence comes from the fact that he is a decadent. Of course, he also says he fights against decadence, but let us remember the physiological reality that Nietzsche is dramatizing in this kind of language. He means that his strong but sensitive nervous system manages to fend off attacks from his illness, which is also a part of him. His life, in this sense, is defined by a dialectic, a contest between health and sickness. Nietzsche accordingly attempts to identify healthy and sick thoughts, not according to the sickliness of the body from which they come, because one could have a strong body plagued by sickness that nevertheless prevails, or have a healthy body that nevertheless endures sickness during certain points in your life. Rather, the evidence is the sign produced. For example, whether one's thoughts express a sick morality or not. We look to the thoughts and reason from them as symptoms to what kind of body produced them, or rather, whether the body at that particular moment was healthy or sick. So we have some ideas that are inventions of the sick. Among the most beautiful inventions of the sick is malice. The sick soul becomes malicious as a result of his power being thwarted otherwise. Quote, "The sick and the weak have more intellect and are more changeable, more variegated, more entertaining, more malicious. The sick alone invented malice." End quote. And we may simply ask, do we detect malice in any of Nietzsche's thought? Can we detect it when he declares war on our modern world? When he says that we Hyperboreans must hold on to our contempt? Do we detect this malice perhaps even in his juvenalia, directed at mankind, and the euphoric hatred of his main character, who wishes to physiologically experiment on human beings, sacrifice people in a kind of misanthropic giddiness? Is Nietzsche's entire campaign against sickness, this table of categories for sick and healthy, is this itself an essentially decadent production, the work of a mind that cannot be conceived of in a purely naive natural state of the soul? In other words, in the state of innocent barbarism of earlier times that Nietzsche celebrated. Is he more of a decadent than he himself would like to admit? Has he not told us that he intends to deceive the world with his doctrines, and above all to deceive us about who he is? One wonders if Nietzsche was not at his healthiest when he warned us that he was, quote, "only fool, only poet." As he says in Beyond Good and Evil, the philosopher's activity is more like that of the poet than he would like to admit, and that the mystics are both more honest and more doltish in how they understand their own activity. As Socrates argues in the dialogue with Ion, the poet is simply one who is inspired, who allows the muse to speak through them, and thus the poet is not dissimilar to the Pythian oracle, or to the Corybantian revelers. He simply gives voice to a god, or, in the Nietzschean language, to the affects, to a drive. As Zarathustra says as he lays down to slumber at noon, "At this moment the world is perfect." And I cannot help but think that this is the kind of sentiment that can only be expressed in the high tonality of the circle, in the kind of a golden mood that characterized the experience of the eternal return. Did Nietzsche perhaps return to this place, immerse himself more fully and completely than ever before upon the dissolution of his personality into the circle? And was not this resting in perfection the very thing that Nietzsche worried could be a sign of exhaustion? Is that not exhaustion itself? And for my part, I would say that these questions are unanswerable, because to answer them would require us to somehow distill health and sickness in Nietzsche's thought, somehow to separate and purify these qualities, as though they were not intimately intertwined with one another, as if Nietzsche did not come from a dual descent. The uncomfortable conclusion at the end of this inquiry is that we cannot separate sickness from health. We cannot separate sickness, therefore, from the totality of Nietzsche's thought. We cannot understand his philosophy if we do not comprehend it as an invention of the sick. Thank you, everyone, for joining me on this excursion into Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle. I've spent a great deal of time on this book. I've picked it up and put it down many times over the past few months. I've reread some of these chapters 5 times or more. And as I said earlier, there's still so much here that we haven't covered. So if you've enjoyed this, I'd highly recommend this book, mainly for advanced readers of Nietzsche who already have an adequate grasp of his general concepts. If you're at that point in your study of Nietzsche, you'll get a lot out of this work. Of course, as Klossowski was influenced by Bataille, I'm sure the calls for me to cover Bataille will only increase. And not to worry, I'm working on that as we speak. That's planned for later in the season, but not immediately. So happy holidays, everyone. Amor Fati, signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.